Stay off the damn weed. And
the Clef Club, and later the Tempo Club, which Europe founded after resigning from the Clef in 1914, served as booking agent for black musicians in New York's hotels and cabarets. Europe's popularity led to a series of recordings of dance music that his orchestra made for Victor Records. It was one of the first contracts ever given by a major record company to a black musician and the first ever to a black orchestra. And when Europe's orchestra performed the Clef Club Carnegie Hall concerts, first on the 2nd of May 1912, then in 1913 and again in 1914. His personal reputation as a conductor, composer, and organizer not only elevated him but benefited Harlem as well. A reviewer of the 1912 concert captured the spirit of a delighted audience. It was an astonishing sight, that Negro audience, a sort of American balalaika, that filled the entire stage with banjos, mandolins, guitars, a few violins, violas, cello, double basses, here and there a wind instrument, some drums, eloquent in syncopation, and the sonorous background of 10 upright pianos corresponding in efficiency to the cymbalon of the Hungarian band. Europe uplifted his baton and the orchestra began, with an accuracy of attack that many a greater band might envy, a stirring march composed by the leader. It was the Pied Piper, again, for as one looked through the audience, one saw heads swaying and feet tapping in time to the incisive rhythm. And when the march neared the end, and the whole band burst out singing as well as playing, the novelty of this climax, a novelty to the whites, at least, brought a very storm of tumultuous applause. After that, the audience settled back with a broad smile of enjoyment. The Harlemites who clamored for tickets and the best seating at Europe's Carnegie Hall concerts shared Europe's pride in the acclaim from New York society and patrons of the arts.
The Castles were a sensation, but much of their success was due to the all-black orchestra which traveled with them everywhere, and to its remarkable leader, James Reese Europe. Europe was a clergyman's son who was raised in Washington, D.C., where he squeezed violin and piano lessons in between the odd jobs he worked to help support his family after his father died. Europe's career took off fast. By the time he was 23, he was the musical director for black shows that had become the latest fashion on Broadway. And well before he met the Castles, he was the preeminent society orchestra leader in New York, playing for the Astors and the Vanderbilts.
The Europe gang were absolute reading sharks. They could read a moving snake, and if a fly lit on that paper, he got played. But the people wanted to believe that Negroes couldn't learn to read music but had a natural talent for it. So we never played with no music. I'd get all the latest Broadway music from the publisher, and we'd learn the tunes and rehearse them until we had them all down pat. Never made no mistakes. All the high-toned, big-time folks would say, "Isn't it wonderful how these untrained, primitive musicians can pick up all the latest songs instantly without being able to read music?" U.B. Blake.
James Reese Europe was not content just to play ragtime. He wanted more. he was convinced that it was his duty to reveal to the world what he called the musical proficiency of the African race. By working with the Castles, Europe saw his chance to bring his orchestrated version of African American music to a far wider audience.
We had a club here in New York called the famous Clef Club, where all the guys were thorough musicians. In order to join it, you had to not only be a great musician, your discipline had to be 100%, your character 100%, because we played for all the rich people, the classy people.
In 1910, a Broadway orchestra director named James Reese Europe formed the Clef Club, a booking agency and union for black musicians. From the cabarets to the concert halls, Europe's orchestras dominated the New York music scene and won new levels of respect and popularity for black musicians.
You have to recognize that the musicians that were in that group all came under the influence of James Reese Europe. This was all a part of what Willie the Lion heard, and he could see around him with the people from the various groups that were put together by James Reese Europe, that there was a melodic strain that he could tap into.
Willie called it beautification, the merging of light classical melodic and harmonic strains with the rhythmic pulse of stride. In this early sound film, Clef Club member Eubie Blake beautified a familiar tune.
When Willie was showing me music or playing, he mainly talked about how you should beautify a piece, how you should make it refined, and you should not bang on the piano, and you should use dynamics. The classical influence dispels the myth that these people were semi-literate or illiterate bums working in bars and they didn't have any understanding of music outside purely instinctive means of performance. These people were sophisticated and were aware of harmony and counterpoint musical structure.
Eubie told me that the fellows in Jim Europe's band could read the spots on a snake's ass. They were so good at sight reading.
Blake also remembered that in the Clef Club orchestras, they sometimes had to hide the music to avoid disappointing white audiences who thought that the black musicians played by ear and couldn't read music.
James Reese Europe, a member of the group, organized the Clef Club in 1910, essentially a black musicians' union. This was the source of contact for dance orchestras of from 3 to 30 men for any occasion. In May of 1912, Europe's Clef Club orchestra of 145 black men gave a concert at Carnegie Hall. Several years later, one white member of the audience recalled the event and favorably reported her and the audience's reaction in the Musical Quarterly. Music-loving Manhattan felt a thrill down its spine such as only the greatest performances can inspire. There were many violins, violas, cellos, and double basses, but it was a motley group of plectrum instruments of all sorts and sizes: mandolins, guitars, banjos, and a few ukuleles. Then there was an indiscriminate assortment of reed and wind instruments. There were drums and tambourines, big and little, whose sharp accents danced across the jagged syncopations of the music, recalling the elaborate drum orchestras of Africa. There was an inspired timpanist. There was a huge bass drum, Curtis Berlin, Black Singers and Players, October 1919, pp. 501 to 594. Other unique features were the 10 upright pianos in 5 pairs and the singing as they played, string and percussion members. The man playing the bass drum and cymbals might well have been singing a high falsetto, while a first violin player sang a second bass. Despite reminders of elaborate drum orchestras of Africa, this group was distinctly American. Artistic credibility for a new-sounding instrumental organization, the jazz orchestra, was in its infancy.
Used to copy most of the things there are originals, but the thing about James Reese Europe, not only was he a composer, musician, arranger, but he also, as Jason mentioned, was the first African American to actually play Carnegie Hall. And he actually played it with his 125-piece orchestra in 1912, 1913, and 1914. So you can imagine what that might have been at the time, because realize that America was only X years out of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal as the standard. So to have an African American band being invited to play at Carnegie Hall and to do such a phenomenal job, that's his orchestra at Carnegie Hall. Now, Jason often says that prior to the war, James Reese Europe was a string man. And this is a banjoline. I had never seen a banjoline original. I've seen it in the pictures, but a banjoline is actually a hybrid between a banjo and a mandolin. It was popularized by James Reese Europe, and as you see, he actually had about 35 members playing banjolines. That banjoline is from 1910, so that would be circa to the era. And to me, again, it was his creativity in terms of combining a banjo, which has its southern origins, and a mandolin. Because realize at the time, pre-jazz, the music of the day was mostly minuets, mostly waltzes, mostly things coming over from Europe. And obviously the dominant instruments and strings were the violins and the mandolins. So what he wound up doing was using